The night the Vampire King looked at the shyest woman in the room, every ancient rule he had lived by began to crumble. Abigail Carter had mastered the art of disappearing long before she learned how to smile without lowering her eyes. At 26, she worked 2 jobs in Boston, serving breakfast at a neighborhood diner before spending her evenings catering elegant galas where the guests wore watches worth more than the apartment building she rented a single room in. She never complained. Complaining didn't pay rent. It didn't cover groceries. It certainly didn't erase the cruel comments she'd heard since high school. Too soft, too round, too noticeable. Ironically, those words taught her to become invisible. Every morning she reached for the same oversized cardigan, the same loose black slacks, and the same plain shoes that hid every curve she believed the world had already judged. She kept her brown hair tied into a simple ponytail, never wore expensive makeup, and avoided mirrors whenever possible. Tonight's event was unlike anything she'd ever seen. Blackstone Manor sat on a cliff overlooking the Atlantic, its towering stone walls glowing beneath hundreds of lanterns despite the cloudy October sky. Luxury cars stretched nearly half a mile down the private driveway while elegantly dressed guests disappeared through towering iron doors beneath crystal chandeliers that shimmered like frozen stars. Abigail adjusted the serving tray in her trembling hands as her supervisor whispered one final warning. No mistakes tonight. These guests aren't ordinary people. She assumed it meant billionaires, politicians, celebrities, or old money families. She had no idea the truth was far stranger. The ballroom seemed to breathe with quiet elegance. Men in perfectly tailored tuxedos spoke in calm voices that somehow carried across the room without effort. Women wearing velvet gowns glided across polished marble floors with impossible grace. None of them touched the elaborate buffet. They accepted only glasses filled with a dark crimson vintage poured into crystal goblets. Abigail noticed it, but quickly reminded herself not to stare. People with unimaginable wealth often had unusual habits. She lowered her gaze and continued weaving carefully between tables, silently counting every step the way she always did whenever anxiety threatened to take over. 8 steps forward. Turn left. Smile politely. Refill glasses. Keep moving. It worked until she felt it. A strange silence spread across the ballroom like winter air rolling over a quiet lake. Conversations faded. Musicians slowed their melody. Even the servers beside her unconsciously stepped backward. Abigail looked up without thinking. A man had entered through the massive oak doors. He was tall enough to command attention without speaking, dressed in a perfectly tailored black suit that seemed to absorb the candlelight instead of reflecting it. His pale face looked carved from marble, framed by dark hair that contrasted sharply against his impossibly fair skin. But it was his eyes that unsettled her most. Cool silver. Calm. Ancient. Every guest bowed their head ever so slightly as he walked through the ballroom with effortless confidence. No introductions. No applause. No announcements. Respect simply followed him like a shadow. Abigail quickly looked away, embarrassed she'd stared even for a second. She didn't know his name. She didn't know why her heartbeat suddenly refused to settle. She only knew that for reasons she couldn't explain, the room no longer felt large enough to hide inside. Abigail lowered her eyes immediately and continued walking, convincing herself that whoever the mysterious guest was, someone like him would never notice someone like her. She carefully refilled another crystal goblet before moving toward the grand staircase where several guests had gathered around a towering marble fireplace. Soft piano music drifted through the ballroom, while quiet conversations blended with the gentle clinking of crystal glasses. Everything felt perfectly rehearsed, perfectly controlled, almost too perfect. Then she noticed something unexpected. Near one of the enormous windows stood a little girl wearing an elegant ivory dress embroidered with silver thread. She could not have been older than 7. Unlike the other guests, she stood completely alone, her tiny fingers pressed against the cold glass as rain quietly traced patterns outside. Everyone passed her without stopping. Some glanced in her direction before quickly looking away. Almost as though approaching her required permission no one possessed. Abigail hesitated. Her supervisor had specifically warned every server not to interact with the guests unless spoken to. But loneliness was a feeling she recognized immediately. It looked exactly the same whether someone lived in a tiny apartment or a stone mansion overlooking the ocean. She quietly picked up a small dessert from a nearby tray and approached with careful steps. "Would you like this?" she asked gently, keeping her voice barely above a whisper. The little girl turned slowly. Her pale blue eyes carried a sadness that seemed much older than childhood itself. Instead of answering, she looked at the dessert, then at Abigail's face, almost searching for something. Abigail smiled warmly. "You do not have to eat it if you do not want to. I just thought it looked too pretty to be left alone." For a heartbeat, neither of them moved. Then the child accepted the plate with both hands and gave the smallest smile Abigail had seen all evening. It lasted only a second, but it completely transformed her face. "Thank you," the little girl whispered. Abigail nodded and quietly stepped away before anyone could accuse her of neglecting her duties. She never noticed several pairs of silver eyes following the brief exchange from across the ballroom. At the center of the gathering, Lucian Ashford had been listening to a discussion about investments and international acquisitions without hearing a single word. His attention had shifted the moment the waitress walked toward the window. Something about her presence disturbed the perfect control he had maintained for centuries. It was not beauty in the ordinary sense. It was kindness offered without expectation, compassion given where everyone else saw inconvenience. He watched as his young niece smiled for the first time in weeks. The change was so subtle that no human would have noticed it. Lucian did. Around him, several members of the ancient families exchanged uneasy glances. "Your Majesty," an older gentleman murmured carefully, "the council has been waiting for your decision." Lucian did not answer immediately. His silver eyes remained fixed on Abigail as she quietly adjusted the oversized sleeve that slipped over her hand while carrying another serving tray. The loose cardigan concealed nearly everything about her except the exhaustion she could not hide. There was no ambition in her movements, no attempt to impress anyone, only quiet determination. Across the room, Abigail suddenly felt the strange sensation again, as though someone had spoken her name without making a sound. She looked up instinctively. Their eyes met for only a brief moment before she quickly looked away, her cheeks warming with embarrassment. She assumed she had broken some unspoken rule by accidentally looking directly at the distinguished guest. She hurried toward the service entrance, unaware that the ancient ruler standing beneath the crystal chandeliers had completely stopped listening to everyone around him. For the first time and longer than anyone could remember, Lucian Ashford found himself curious about a single ordinary human woman who seemed determined to remain invisible. Abigail pushed through the service door into the quieter hallway behind the ballroom and released a slow breath she had not realized she had been holding. The cheerful conversations faded behind thick stone walls, replaced by the distant sound of rain tapping against tall, stained glass windows. She carefully rested the silver tray on a preparation table and rubbed her tired wrists. 14 hours on her feet had left every muscle aching, but she still had another 3 hours before the event ended. "You are doing fine," she whispered to herself, repeating the same encouragement her late grandmother had taught her years ago. One step at a time. A fellow server hurried past carrying fresh bottles. "Table 12 needs more glasses," he said before disappearing through another doorway. Abigail nodded, lifted a polished tray filled with crystal goblets, and headed back toward the ballroom. As she stepped through the grand entrance again, laughter floated through the air, but something had changed. The atmosphere felt tighter, quieter beneath the surface, almost as though everyone was waiting for something invisible to happen. She walked carefully between elegantly dressed guests, making certain every glass remained perfectly balanced. Halfway across the ballroom, she noticed movement near the orchestra. The little girl she had spoken with earlier was no longer standing by the window. Instead, she wandered alone toward one of the decorative balconies where the marble floor became slightly damp from guests entering with rain on their shoes. Abigail instinctively glanced around for the child's family. No one seemed to notice. At that exact moment, one of the musicians shifted a heavy instrument stand. Startled by the sudden noise, the little girl stepped backward without looking. Her small shoe landed on the damp marble. Time seemed to slow. Abigail saw the tiny foot lose its balance. The crystal tray in her hands weighed nearly 20 pounds, but she did not think. She moved. The tray slid onto a nearby serving table with a sharp clink as she crossed the distance in only a few hurried steps. Just before the little girl stumbled, Abigail gently caught her shoulders, and steadied her. "Easy," she said softly with a reassuring smile. "I have you." The child blinked twice before wrapping both hands around Abigail's sleeve, relief replacing surprise. Several nearby conversations stopped instantly. Guests who had ignored the child only moments earlier now stared in complete silence. Abigail looked around, confused by their expressions. Had she broken another rule? Before anyone could answer, a calm but commanding voice echoed across the ballroom. "Is Lyra unharmed?" Every guest immediately stepped aside. Lucian Ashford approached with measured confidence, his polished shoes making almost no sound against the marble floor. His silver eyes moved first to the little girl, carefully examining her face, then slowly lifted toward Abigail. There was no anger in his expression, only careful observation. Lyra smiled faintly and nodded. "She helped me," the child said quietly, still holding Abigail's oversized sleeve. The silence deepened. Several distinguished guests exchanged uneasy glances as though the simple sentence carried far greater meaning than Abigail could understand. Lucian stopped only a few feet away. Up close, his presence felt even more extraordinary. The air itself seemed cooler around him, yet his gaze rested on Abigail with surprising calm. "Thank you," he said, his deep voice carrying through the ballroom without effort. Abigail blinked in surprise. She had expected criticism. Instead, she found herself receiving gratitude from the most respected man in the room. "Anyone would have done the same," she answered honestly. A faint expression crossed Lucian's face, almost too subtle to recognize. It resembled disappointment mixed with quiet certainty. He slowly glanced around the ballroom, where dozens of guests immediately lowered their eyes. They all knew the truth. No one else had moved. Only she had. Lucian's quiet words settled over the ballroom with a weight Abigail could not explain. She offered a polite nod, gently loosened Lyra's tiny fingers from her oversized sleeve, and reached for the serving tray she had left behind. To her surprise, the little girl immediately reached for her hand again. "Will you stay with me for a minute?" Lyra asked so softly that only the people closest could hear. Abigail glanced toward her supervisor across the room, expecting an impatient wave or disapproving look, but the man stood frozen, uncertain whether anyone should interrupt the exchange. Before Abigail could answer, Lucian spoke. "You may remain with her." It sounded less like a suggestion and more like a decision that no one intended to challenge. Abigail smiled gently. "Only until someone from your family comes to find you." Lyra nodded happily. Together they walked toward a quieter corner of the ballroom, where a grand fireplace cast warm light across polished stone. Abigail noticed framed paintings covering the walls, each depicting generations of dignified families whose pale faces seemed almost impossibly lifelike. One portrait caught her attention. A young woman wearing a flowing midnight blue gown stood beside a man whose silver eyes looked strangely familiar. The resemblance to Lucian was unmistakable. "She was kind," Lyra whispered, following Abigail's gaze. "Everyone says she smiled at everyone, even when they were afraid of her." Abigail looked closer before offering a small smile. "She looks like someone who made people feel safe." Behind them, Lucian heard every word. Something ancient stirred within him, an emotion he had carefully buried beneath centuries of discipline. Very few people had ever described the woman in the portrait that way. Fewer still had done so without already knowing her story. Across the ballroom, members of several distinguished families quietly exchanged concerned expressions. An elderly woman wearing a deep emerald gown leaned toward a white-haired gentleman. "His Majesty has spoken to that human 3 times tonight," she murmured. "That has never happened." The older man kept his eyes on Lucian. "It is not the conversations that concern me." "Then what does?" "Look at him." She did. Lucian Ashford remained perfectly still, yet his attention had never drifted far from the young waitress whose loose cardigan nearly swallowed her small frame. He was observing every movement she made with calm, unwavering focus. The elderly woman's expression slowly changed. "Impossible," she whispered. Meanwhile, Abigail noticed that Lyra had begun shivering ever so slightly. Without thinking, she slipped off her oversized cardigan and carefully draped it around the little girl's shoulders. The sleeves hung far beyond Lyra's hands, making the child giggle for the first time that evening. "Much better," Abigail said warmly. "Sometimes comfort is more important than elegance." The simple sentence echoed farther than she intended. Lucian's silver eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly. The words awakened a distant memory from a lifetime so old that even history had nearly forgotten it. He remembered another gentle voice saying something remarkably similar beside a castle fireplace centuries earlier. The memory vanished as quickly as it had appeared, leaving only an unfamiliar pull deep within his immortal heart. At that exact moment, every candle lining the ballroom flickered once. Crystal chandeliers shimmered. A faint golden light flashed beneath the cuff of Lucian's tailored sleeve before disappearing again. No human seemed to notice. The ancient nobles did. Several of them quietly rose from their seats in alarm, their composed expressions replaced by genuine concern. Abigail remained completely unaware. She was smiling at Lyra, helping the little girl straighten the oversized cardigan that had nearly slipped from her shoulders, never realizing that one simple act of kindness had awakened something the oldest families believed had been silent for centuries. The golden shimmer disappeared so quickly that Abigail assumed the flickering candles had simply played tricks on her tired eyes. She gently adjusted the cardigan around Lyra's shoulders before standing. "I should get back to work," she said with a warm smile. "Your family will worry if they cannot find you." Lyra looked disappointed, but she nodded obediently. "Will you come back?" Abigail laughed softly. "If they schedule me here again, maybe." She turned toward the service area, unaware that nearly every ancient noble in the ballroom had begun watching her instead of the evening's distinguished guests. Lucian remained silent. His expression revealed nothing, yet his mind moved through memories older than the nations surrounding the estate. The faint golden light beneath his sleeve had not appeared for centuries. It belonged to an ancient covenant that every vampire king learned as legend rather than history. The mark was never supposed to awaken without a direct blood ritual. Yet no ritual had taken place. No sacred ceremony. Only an ordinary human woman offering kindness without asking for anything in return. "Your Majesty." The voice belonged to Lord Cedric Hawthorne, the eldest member of the Royal Council. His silver hair framed a face marked by centuries of discipline. "May I have a private word?" Lucian gave the slightest nod before following him toward a quiet gallery overlooking the ballroom. Behind closed doors, Cedric lowered his voice. "You felt it." "It was not a question." Lucian answered calmly. "I did." Cedric's expression darkened. "The old signs cannot return. The prophecy was sealed long ago." Lucian looked through the tall windows toward Abigail, who was once again balancing heavy serving trays while quietly helping another employee collect empty glasses. "Prophecies do not concern themselves with what we believe possible," he replied. "She is human," Cedric insisted. "She knows nothing of our world." "That is precisely what troubles me." Back inside the ballroom, Abigail accepted another tray from the kitchen staff. It felt heavier than the last, nearly 25 pounds of crystal and polished silver. She shifted the weight carefully and continued through the crowded room. As she passed one of the grand columns, two elegantly dressed women spoke just loudly enough for her to hear. "Such a shame," one said with a sympathetic smile that never reached her eyes. "Loose clothing cannot hide everything forever." The other quietly laughed. Abigail kept walking without reacting. She had heard variations of those words for years. They no longer surprised her. What surprised her was the quiet voice that interrupted them. "Confidence is measured by character, not appearance." Both women immediately straightened. Lucian Ashford stood only a few feet away. His tone remained perfectly calm, but neither woman attempted another comment. They simply bowed their heads before stepping aside in embarrassed silence. Abigail blinked in confusion. She was not even certain he had been speaking to them. She quietly continued toward the next table, determined not to become the center of attention again. Yet something had already changed. Staff members who had ignored her earlier now greeted her politely. Several guests offered respectful smiles instead of dismissive glances. Even her supervisor seemed unusually careful when assigning her duties. It was as though an invisible current had swept through the ballroom, altering the way everyone responded to her presence. Abigail could not explain it. Lucian could. Every person in that room understood one simple truth. The Vampire King had spoken in her defense twice in a single evening. Among the ancient houses, such moments were never dismissed as coincidence. They were remembered. And for the first time in countless generations, whispers began spreading quietly beneath the music that perhaps destiny had entered Blackstone Manor wearing an oversized cardigan instead of a royal crown. The orchestra began another graceful melody as the evening settled into an elegant rhythm. Yet beneath the polished conversations, something invisible continued shifting through Blackstone Manor. Abigail sensed it every time she crossed the ballroom. Guests who had barely acknowledged the catering staff now stepped aside to give her room. A few even thanked her when she refreshed their glasses. The sudden kindness felt almost more unsettling than the earlier indifference. She quietly reminded herself not to read too much into it. One unusual evening did not change an ordinary life. As she carried a fresh tray toward the eastern wing, she noticed an elderly gentleman standing alone near an enormous library. Unlike the others, he held no glass and seemed more interested in the old books lining the walls than the celebration itself. When Abigail passed, one of the thick leather-bound volumes slipped from a display shelf and landed on the polished floor with a heavy thud. Before anyone else reacted, she carefully set down her tray and picked up the book with both hands. "I believe this belongs here," she said gently, brushing a little dust from the cover before placing it back exactly where it had been. The elderly gentleman watched her with quiet curiosity. "Most people would have called for a servant," he observed. Abigail smiled politely. "I am one." The old man laughed softly, a genuine laugh that carried warmth instead of mockery. "Perhaps, but you still chose to help when nobody expected you to." She shrugged with quiet simplicity. "Small things matter too." He nodded thoughtfully, as though committing every word to memory. Hidden several yards away, Lucian had witnessed the exchange without interrupting. Lord Cedric approached beside him, his expression growing increasingly concerned. "She keeps choosing kindness when there is no reward," Cedric murmured. "Exactly as the old records described." Lucian remained silent. His gaze followed Abigail as she resumed serving guests with the same quiet determination she had shown all evening. Nothing about her suggested ambition or calculation. She did not seek attention. She did not linger near influential people. In fact, every opportunity she had to disappear into the background, she accepted without hesitation. That alone made her unlike almost everyone who entered Blackstone Manor. Moments later, a member of the kitchen staff hurried toward Abigail, looking flustered. "We are short on desserts in the west dining room," he whispered. "Can you help?" "Of course," she answered immediately. Together they carried several trays toward the adjoining hall where smaller groups of guests enjoyed quieter conversations. As Abigail arranged the desserts, she noticed one plate had been prepared with almonds. She remembered seeing Lyra politely refuse almonds earlier in the evening. Without hesitation, she exchanged the dessert for another before the plate reached the child's table. She mentioned she does not enjoy these. Abigail explained to the surprised server. The young employee blinked. "You remembered?" Abigail smiled. "People remember when someone listens." From across the room, Lucian heard every word. His ancient memory reached back through centuries filled with kingdoms, treaties, victories, and endless formal ceremonies. Yet very few moments had ever carried such effortless compassion. Beside him, Cedric quietly closed his eyes. "The signs continue," he whispered. Before Lucian could answer, a distinguished woman wearing a deep sapphire gown approached with careful composure. She bowed respectfully before speaking. "Your Majesty, the council requests your presence in the private chamber immediately. They believe the awakening can no longer be ignored." Lucian glanced once more toward Abigail, who was laughing softly with Lyra over a tiny dessert shaped like a star, completely unaware that an ancient council had just decided her ordinary life was about to intersect with secrets guarded for centuries. Lucian entered the private council chamber without a single hurried step, yet every elder seated around the circular obsidian table immediately rose to their feet. The heavy oak doors closed behind him, sealing away the music and laughter from the ballroom below. Candlelight reflected across ancient stone walls covered with symbols that had existed long before Blackstone Manor had ever been built. No one spoke for several moments. Finally, Cedric placed an aged leather journal onto the table and carefully opened it. The brittle pages revealed illustrations faded by centuries, each describing forgotten royal traditions passed from one vampire king to the next. Cedric pointed toward a sketch showing a human woman standing beneath a constellation while surrounded by golden light. "The Chronicle of the First Covenant," he said quietly. "Every generation believed it was symbolic. Lucian studied the drawing without changing expression. The woman wore simple clothing. She carried no crown, no jewels, no weapon, only an expression of quiet compassion remarkably similar to the one Abigail had shown throughout the evening. Read the passage, Lucian instructed. Cedric obeyed. When the immortal throne forgets mercy, destiny will return wearing ordinary hands. The true bond shall awaken not through conquest, wealth, or bloodshed, but through kindness freely given. Silence settled over the chamber once again. Several council members shifted uneasily. Lady Eleanor finally broke the quiet. Your Majesty, we cannot allow ancient legends to influence the kingdom. Another elder nodded. The human must leave before sunrise. Distance will end whatever has begun. Lucian slowly closed the journal himself. You assume something has begun because of proximity. Has it not? Cedric asked carefully. Lucian answered with complete honesty. I do not know. Back in the ballroom, Abigail was completely unaware of the discussion unfolding only one floor above her. She finished arranging the final dessert display before helping another server polish empty crystal glasses. The evening was beginning to wind down. Guests gradually gathered their coats while quiet conversations turned toward travel plans and business meetings. Abigail smiled to herself. Another successful shift meant another paycheck. Perhaps this month she could finally replace the worn soles on her work shoes. As she carried a basket of folded linen toward the service entrance, she heard quick footsteps behind her. Lyra came running with the oversized cardigan still wrapped around her shoulders. You almost forgot this, the little girl said, carefully holding it out with both hands. Abigail laughed softly. I guess I did. She accepted the cardigan and gently folded it over her arm. Thank you. Lyra hesitated before asking, will I ever see you again? Abigail paused. The world is full of surprises. Maybe one day. The child smiled hopefully before returning to her family. Hidden behind one of the marble columns, Lucian had witnessed the exchange from beginning to end. Once again, there had been no expectation of reward, no attempt to impress anyone, only quiet sincerity. Something inside him, something that had remained perfectly still for centuries, continued refusing to return to silence. At that exact moment, a servant approached and bowed respectfully. Your Majesty, Miss Carter has completed her duties. The transportation van for the catering staff leaves in 5 minutes. Lucian looked toward the grand entrance where Abigail quietly thanked every member of the kitchen staff before gathering her small canvas bag. She was preparing to walk away from Blackstone Manor exactly as she had entered it, believing the evening had been nothing more than another ordinary shift. Lucian's silver eyes remained fixed on her as one unmistakable realization settled over him. If she left tonight without answers, the mystery surrounding the ancient awakening would leave with her. The cool night air drifted through the open entrance as members of the catering staff gathered near the service corridor, quietly preparing to leave. Abigail slipped her oversized cardigan back over her shoulders, adjusted the strap of her canvas bag, and thanked the kitchen manager for the opportunity to work the event. You did excellent tonight, he said with unusual sincerity. I hope they ask for you again. Abigail smiled gratefully. So do I. She started toward the exit, listening to the soft rhythm of rain falling beyond the covered driveway. For the first time all evening, she allowed herself to believe the night was finally over. Then a calm voice interrupted the quiet. Miss Carter. Every conversation stopped. Abigail turned slowly. Lucian Ashford stood several yards away beneath the grand archway, his black coat resting neatly across his shoulders. Even without raising his voice, he somehow commanded the attention of everyone nearby. Abigail instinctively glanced behind her, wondering if he had been speaking to someone else. There was no one there. Yes, sir, she asked politely. Lucian walked forward with measured confidence until only a respectful distance remained between them. His expression stayed composed, yet his silver eyes searched hers with thoughtful intensity rather than authority. I wish to thank you personally for the kindness you showed Lyra this evening. Abigail shook her head gently. She is a wonderful little girl. She did not need thanks. She only needed someone to notice she was standing alone. Lucian remained silent for a moment. Few people answered him so honestly. Fewer still did so without fear or hidden ambition. Would you allow me to arrange transportation home? He asked. Abigail smiled apologetically. That is generous. but the catering van is already waiting, and I do not live very far from the diner where I work tomorrow morning." Lucian noticed the familiar pattern once again. She declined comfort without resentment, accepted hardship without complaint, and spoke of long work days as though they were simply part of life. Before he could answer, Cedric quietly approached from behind. "Your Majesty," he said with careful restraint, "the council awaits your final decision." Abigail immediately stepped backward. "I should not keep you." She offered a respectful nod before turning toward the waiting van. Just then, a folded piece of paper slipped unnoticed from the side pocket of her canvas bag and drifted onto the polished stone floor. She continued walking without realizing it. Lucian bent down and picked it up before anyone else could. It was not money or anything valuable. It was a worn grocery list written in neat handwriting. Milk, bread, soup, laundry detergent. At the bottom, another line had been added inside a small heart. "Do not forget to believe in yourself." Lucian read the final sentence twice before carefully folding the paper exactly as he had found it. He caught up with Abigail just before she reached the doorway. "Miss Carter." She turned again. "You dropped this." Abigail accepted the paper with visible relief. "Thank you. I thought I had lost it." Lucian glanced toward the handwritten message. "Someone gave you wise advice." Abigail looked down at the little heart drawn beneath the words and smiled with quiet affection. "My grandmother wrote that before she passed away. I carry it everywhere." Something softened behind Lucian's calm expression. The ancient ruler who had outlived kingdoms found himself unexpectedly moved by a piece of folded paper worth almost nothing. Abigail slipped the note safely back into her bag, thanked him once more, and climbed into the catering van. As the vehicle disappeared beyond the iron gates of Blackstone Manor, Lucian remained standing beneath the falling rain, watching until the distant taillights vanished into the darkness. Only then did he quietly turn towards Cedric and speak the words that caused every nearby council member to freeze. "Find everything there is to know about Abigail Carter. Leave her life undisturbed. But I intend to learn why destiny chose someone who has spent her entire life believing she was invisible." The following morning arrived with steady rain and gray skies stretching across Boston. Abigail unlocked the front door of the neighborhood diner at 5:30, tied on her faded apron, and quietly began another ordinary day. Coffee brewed. Pancakes sizzled. Regular customers wandered in carrying umbrellas and morning newspapers. Nothing about the small restaurant suggested that anything extraordinary had happened the night before. Abigail almost convinced herself she had imagined the elegance of Blackstone Manor altogether. Meanwhile, miles away, the great council chamber stood unusually silent. Cedric placed a slim folder before Lucian. "Everything we could learn overnight," he said respectfully. Lucian opened it. There was almost nothing remarkable inside. Abigail Carter, 26 years old. 2 jobs. No criminal record. No inherited fortune. No famous relatives. She volunteered twice a month at a neighborhood food pantry. She regularly delivered groceries to an elderly neighbor without charging for gasoline. She anonymously paid for children's meals whenever she received extra tips. Lucian slowly closed the folder. "Nothing explains the awakening," Cedric admitted. "Exactly," Lucian answered. "Perhaps that is why it happened." Before anyone could respond, the heavy chamber doors opened. Lady Eleanor entered carrying a velvet case sealed with the royal crest. "Your Majesty," she said carefully, "the Royal Archive requested this be examined immediately." Lucian opened the case and found an ancient silver pendant surrounding a smooth crystal that had remained colorless for centuries. The moment he touched it, the crystal shimmered with soft golden light. Every council member fell completely silent. Cedric exhaled slowly. "The Heartstone has recognized the bond." Lady Eleanor looked genuinely troubled. Then the prophecy was never symbolic. Lucian's expression remained calm, yet his decision became unmistakably clear. "Prepare the Eastern residents." Several council members looked at one another in disbelief. "Your Majesty," Cedric began cautiously, "you are inviting a human into royal territory?" Lucian looked toward the rain beyond the tall windows. "No." He paused. "I am creating a place where she may choose to visit if she ever wishes." Back at the diner, Abigail balanced 3 breakfast plates while laughing softly with an elderly customer who insisted she made the best coffee in Boston. She thanked him warmly, completely unaware that one of the most powerful men in the world had just refused to let ancient tradition decide another person's future without her consent. As the morning continued, a familiar little voice echoed through the diner doorway. "Miss Abigail." She looked up in surprise. Lyra stood there holding a bouquet of white daisies almost as large as herself. Beside her stood Lucian Ashford, dressed simply in a charcoal overcoat that drew curious glances from nearby customers without revealing his true identity. Abigail hurried forward with a delighted smile. "Lyra, what a wonderful surprise." The little girl offered the flowers with both hands. "These are for you because you made me smile." Abigail accepted them carefully, touched beyond words. She looked toward Lucian. "You did not have to come all this way." His silver eyes met hers with the same quiet steadiness they had carried throughout the previous evening. "Some journeys are worth making." Outside, the rain gradually faded as sunlight finally broke through the clouds, casting warm light across the diner's front windows. Neither Abigail nor Lucian spoke for several seconds. They simply stood there sharing an unexpected moment of peace while the ordinary sounds of breakfast continued around them. No prophecy announced itself. No ancient law interrupted the silence. Only a simple kindness had become the first bridge between two completely different worlds. And somewhere deep within the oldest halls of Blackstone Manor, the ancient heartstone continued glowing softly, as though reminding every immortal who passed that even the coldest kings sometimes found their greatest strength in the quiet kindness of an ordinary human heart.